Okay, Rhapsody was the first route that was ever graded E11. Up until that point, there'd been one or two confirmed E10s and several proposed E10s that hadn't yet been repeated, or even a few E10s that had then been downgraded. And then came Rhapsody, which was this huge big deal for the UK trad climbing scene, and this was around 2005 or 2006, I think. And then at that point in my life, I'd started to climb some fairly hard routes on the Gritstone in the middle of the UK. This is where I grew up, where I really learned to climb. And I'd actually put up a few of my own first ascents. I'd repeated a route called Equilibrium, which was the world's first E10 and the hardest trad route in the world when that one was climbed. We're going to say hardest trad route in the world a lot in this conversation, so sorry to the listeners if it gets a little bit boring. And then I basically ended up putting up another one of my own first ascents in a completely different part of the country, a completely different style to all of the routes that I climbed before. Just in hindsight, I realized that the route didn't suit me, and this is why it felt so hard. But at the time, I just thought that it was hard because it was simply hard. And I was so one of the points that you made earlier, and about me saying that this might be one of the hardest trad routes out there in the world, if not the hardest, is something that I really try and stay away from these days, because if I've learned one thing over the last 15 years, it's that my hardest is only ever going to be my hardest. And it depends on so many outside factors, whether or not you're good in this style, how strong are you in this grip strength, in the length of the route, and all loads of other different factors. So I really try and just focus on myself. That's not supposed to sound like really egotistical, but yeah. Just I can only control what I can do, and I don't have any control over other people. Right. So
you're more likely to say this is the hardest route I've ever done in this style.
Exactly.
To it's the hardest in the world. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I climbed this route called the Walk of Life. I told people it was the hardest trad route in the world at the time. I gave it the never before given grade of E12. I'd actually been to try this route called Rhapsody, which was the only 11 at the time. I'd failed to do Rhapsody. I'd come up with some bullshit reason that I didn't want to climb the route because I thought the line was contrived, that the route was somewhat eliminate, and I wasn't in climbing for those kind of reasons. The base fact was that I knew deep down that I couldn't do the route, but I actually didn't want to admit that to people and to the climbing world. I don't think I even wanted to admit that to myself. So all these things blur together inside my memory bank. But I think at the time, I actually convinced myself the reason I didn't want to climb Rhapsody was because I didn't want to, not that I couldn't.
Hey friends, I want to take a second to tell you about my new favorite climbing shoes. I fell in love with these this year. This is the Drone CS from Madrock. It's an amazing bouldering shoe, and I actually sent all of my hardest boulders in 2023 wearing the Drone CS. I also just got my first pair of the Drone 2.0. The Drone 2.0 is a huge improvement over the original, in my opinion. It has a lot of the same features as the Drone CS, which I love. It's just a little bit stiffer and more supportive, and you can really toe into small footholds and edge really well with this shoe. I really love both of these shoes, and I think they complement each other really well. If you want to check them out, head over to madrock.com and use code NUGGET at checkout to save 10% off your first order. That's madrock.com. Use code NUGGET to save 10% off your order. All right, enjoy the rest of the video.
Anyway, so I graded my route E12. And then shortly after that, a whole series of first ascents that I'd done, where, the grade of this route, the Walk of Life, had somewhat been based upon, were repeated. Some of them were downgraded. And then Dave McLeod, the first ascensionist of Rhapsody, went to try my route, repeated it in very short amount of time, a couple of days. Yeah. The Walk of Life, and basically told everybody that it really wasn't that hard. So that's probably about 2 years of my life summed up in 2 minutes? Yeah. We're doing a good job.
Yeah, we did. You did a very good job. I'll chime in and add a couple more pieces of context, not to bog us down here, but just to clue people into the timeline. Again, Rhapsody around 2005, Walk of Life around 2008. James is just kind of exploding onto the UK trad scene in this time. just cruising through, like you talked about repeating these routes, but you kind of cruise through all the hardest grit routes, period at the time. And you're like a teenager kind of coming into your early 20s. And then I think you did Walk of Life around, how old were you? Early 20s, 22 or something like that?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So you had, in a way, like it makes sense where your thought process was at. And I watched a video about this where you got a little bit more into your psyche and you're thinking about it, and it just makes sense. Or I don't know where I heard this. I can't remember. Maybe it was in one of your voice messages, but just about how the Walk of Life was such a far cry in style from what you had done. Instead of a really short, really intense grit route that's like basically a highball boulder problem with a death landing or whatever, these are some of the things that you had done before. All of a sudden you're climbing like a 50-meter sea cliff. And for people that recognize that name, Walk of Life, I talked about it quite a lot with Anna Hazelnut, because she's done that one, and she's done the route to the left, Once Upon a Time. Is that right? Yeah, exactly. To your point, like it's such a different type of climbing. Instead of a short, really intense, 10-meter grit thing, all of a sudden this is a 40-meter slab where it takes you an hour to lead it, and you just think you're going to die the entire time. So like, what a different psychological space you had to enter into for this route than anything you'd ever done before. I can kind of like, I just makes sense, so. Like where your head was at and why you would think it was such a next level. But of course, like, the news comes out, then Dave McLeod climbs it, thinks it's way easier than the grade you proposed, and all of a sudden, all the nuance is lost. The internet just comes after you. I think with hindsight, we say with hindsight, all vision is 2020. Mm-hmm. Like everyone sees perfectly when we look back, and I can look back now and I can see exactly where I went wrong and how all this could have happened. And I think partly that was to do with me and my own sort of mental place in the world at that time. I was just searching for recognition. I can remember as a kid trying all these new sports, and I was always just obsessed about getting as good as I could, as quick as I could, to become somebody in that world. And most of the time, I'd kind of run up against a little hurdle and I'd just move on to something else. And then eventually I found climbing, and it just seemed to really fit. And for the first several years of my climbing life, I was just going from strength to strength to strength. And so I was there climbing all these hard routes, like you rightly said, on the gritstone, which is a very, very specific climbing style. And I'd developed this sort of, can't really call it a technique, but it was like almost like a mental strategy for climbing these incredibly scary routes, where when I'd actually get on the sharp end, when I'd get on the lead on these things, after normally the hardest routes on the gritstone are done after some top rope practice. So you might spend, hours or days or weeks, however long, practicing these things. And eventually you feel you're ready and you go for it on the lead. And a lot of these routes that I did toward the end of that period of my life, I wasn't even really able to top rope them. Certainly not regularly. Some of them never at all. And I just rely on this feeling that I knew, or I assumed would appear when I got on the lead, which was this like bubble of peace and tranquility, and where I'd be stronger and I'd feel more focused. And I basically just turned into this super climber, or at least, a super climber for me. And I'd be able to do moves and sequences that I couldn't do or even really conceive of without this magical thing happening. Wow. And this is what allowed me to climb these really pretty intense routes on the grit. And it's what I relied on to get myself up them. And then on the Walk of Life, that bubble burst, because instead of being 2 or 3 minutes of climbing, it turned into an hour, and the style was completely different, and the feelings I got were completely different. So everything that I'd built and learned and prepared for, to deal with this kind of intense level of stress that you get when you're on a really dangerous route, just didn't really work anymore. And that's why I personally found the route so hard.